Merry Christmas, guys. So this episode's about floating cabins versus manufactured houseboats, an actual boat.
Let's get to it. So everybody knows what a manufactured houseboat is. A lot of people have never seen a floating cabin. So just briefly to sum up, what the heck these are and where you can even find them. A floating cabin is basically a house, it's a structure, it's not a boat, it's built like a normal house, but it is on some sort of flotation device. For us, that's styrofoam, could be, barrels, it could be lift floats. It's basically a house that's floating. Obviously, these are a lot less common than a manufactured houseboat. They're not even allowed on all lakes. We are on a TVA dammed lake. There are how many, 7 or 8 different lakes that allow these in the TVA system.
It's a bunch.
I think mostly in the southeast. We're here in North Carolina. On this lake, for example, there's some 300-400 of these. We've also seen on the internet different places around the world, Amsterdam, Switzerland, some places like that have communities of floating homes.
Super nice floating homes.
Yeah, like
whole
mansions.
Different idea than what we're sitting on here, but they're on docks right next to a city street. People are learning to live on the water, and it's, you're not buying land, so you're saving there. And pros and cons to everything.
So, without further ado, we will start sharing some of the differences between these floating cabins and the houseboats and which is a smarter buy for your goals.
So mobility, that's the number one question that we get asked. Can you drive your floating house around? Well, a floating house doesn't get driven around. It just sits in one spot and you have another boat that you take around. The manufactured boats, depending on where you are, some places people drive these 70-foot houseboats up and down the lake, beach them, hang out for a week or two. Here, not many people take their houseboats out, maybe once a year. So the mobility part is, if you want a floating house or a houseboat, is are you really going to untie this 70-foot houseboat and take it out? Rule of thumb is the bigger the boat, the less you take it away from its dock. It's just so much work to do it. So if you're highly motivated and you're in a place where people like to take their big houseboats and go moor them up for a week or two, maybe that's what you...
Camping.
Yeah, houseboat camping, maybe that's what you need to do. For us, we'll take the boat, the small boat, wherever we need, and our floating cabin can stay on a mooring.
If you're kind of just looking for a central hub to hang out on and entertain people and spend time with your loved ones, maybe a floating house would be a good option. If you're looking more for something mobile that you can actually take to different places, go, houseboat camping or use as an actual vessel, obviously you would want to use a manufactured houseboat for that. So that one's pretty simple.
All right, point number 2, houseboat feel versus floating cabin feel. What does it feel like to be on either or? Floating house is a big platform. When you get hit with wakes and wind, it doesn't rock the same as an actual boat with a hull. So a big houseboat with a hull may rock side to side, or list as it's called, and a floating cabin will just hop up and down, but it's all one big fat structure. So that's part of the feel, the weight, also the inside of it. A houseboat is built like a boat. You've got berths in it. All the systems are run DC, AC, depending on if you ship to shore power.
You'll actually have a steering wheel and a captain's chair like a boat would.
Yeah, so you get more of a nautical feel out of it. The floating cabins, you're in a house. I mean, this is a house. It feels like you're in a tiny home. So the feel of it is not like you're on a boat, besides staring out the front window at the water.
Do you want to feel like you're in a boat? Do you want to have that kind of nautical vibe going on? Or if you're aiming more for the comfort of a house still and not leaving those things from your primary home behind, but the environment and lifestyle of a boat, then a floating house would be a better option than a manufactured houseboat. For us, we're living full time out here, so that's kind of why we chose the floating house, because this actually is our house. There are people that live full time on houseboats, but one difference, and this is I guess kind of leading into our next point, that is really huge for the floating houses versus the houseboats is insulation.
Insulation.
So for us being here in the winter, that was a really important deciding factor. We really needed something that was going to be warm, that was going to keep us well insulated. You know, we have a 4-degree forecast in the next couple days, so I would not want to be on a manufactured houseboat when it's 4 degrees.
If you live on a manufactured houseboat, the walls are real thin and they're made of glass normally. There might be balsa cord just depending on how it's built, but these boats are not really built for sub-zero winter temperatures. If you have electricity and you live on that manufactured boat, like some of the people we have in our harbor, they have central air and heat, so it's just constantly pumping heat. But when they lose power, that heat dissipates and goes very fast. There's no real insulation in that boat itself. This house here is insulated with high dollar insulation, and it will hold heat. Without electricity, we've got wood stove or gas heat, and we can actually heat this place up to say 75 at 10:30 at night, go to bed, not put any more heat in it, and when we wake up in the morning, 65 degrees, because the heat stayed in it, because it's insulated like a home.
And the cost of keeping a houseboat heated, that might be something you need to consider as well, because if you're constantly having to run that heat and either the gas from a generator or just a power meter at a marina or whatever it may be, that is all the time. You're not going to be able to turn that off or the heat will immediately dissipate. So if you're doing any kind of cold weather winter usage for this vessel or house, I would probably recommend a floating cabin.
So the next point is resale value. And just like with driving it and what you're doing, that's all going to be affected by the area you're in. Floating cabins on this lake resale are huge.
Much higher.
They sell in 5-10 minutes. Everybody wants one, they're grandfathered in. So the resale here is quick. There's a lot of money in it because there's a lot of people interested in getting them. The manufactured boats, they won't sell in less than 5-10 minutes on the market. We've seen some sit for a year, 2 years, then they'll sell.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the ease of purchasing them, the market saturation basically. You can find houseboats anywhere. You can find them on Craigslist, you can find them on Facebook Marketplace, you can get them straight from the manufacturer, brand new. If you want one, you can get one. Floating houses, on the other hand, are much less common. They're much harder to find. They're not allowed on all lakes, so it's definitely a smaller market. And of course, that's going to make, with supply and demand, the resale value a lot higher. Another
thing to look at, a manufactured houseboat, you can actually get insurance on a lot easier. The floating cabins just now got to where you can insure these floating cabins. So that was also a deterrent, and people want houseboats because they can insure their investment. We now, as of this year, just got an insurance company that will insure our floating cabins for us. Now we'll talk about maintenance. Floating house, floating cabin, manufactured boat. It's a boat. It's on the water. There's always going to be maintenance. The manufactured boats are made of fiberglass. There's a lot less maintenance there. They have an aluminum hull. All the systems in them, they're going to break just like any other boat. If you ever own a boat, it's not going to last. You got to constantly maintain it to keep it going. Floating house made of all wood. Did they use pressure treated lumber? Was the lumber sealed? There's all kinds of factors. We rebuilt this one from the ground up, and we're still working on stuff that breaks. The maintenance on both, you're going to have maintenance no matter what you do. And if you're not prepared to put 5 to 15% of the value of the boat into the boat every year for maintenance, then it's just going to rot away. I mean, that's any boat you own, you always got to keep it up.
But I think two big differences in maintenance is for the floating houses, obviously you don't have a hull. It's floating, in our case, on encapsulated styrofoam. If you're buying a floating house, you're going to want to make sure that the foundation is solid. It's a lot easier to maintain everything else, but if it's not on solid floats, that's going to be really expensive and difficult to fix. Whereas on a houseboat, you just have the aluminum hull, so you don't even have to worry about that. On the flip side, on a houseboat, you have a motor and all of those systems, that you're gonna have to be maintaining, whereas you don't have that on a floating house because it's stationary. So that's one less thing that you have to worry about on a floating house. Another thing to consider is just aesthetics. Going back to the whole, what is the feel that you're trying to go for? Do you want it to be like a really cute little house, a little cottage, kind of like a tiny home, or do you want it to look like a boat? With floating homes, you can play around a lot more with the actual aesthetics, what exactly you want it to look like, just like you can a house. The sky's the limit. You can make it look like whatever you want it to. Whereas with a houseboat, you're 100% limited by the original structure of the boat. You can't just rebuild new walls and a new roof and make it look like something that it's not. It is a boat and you're gonna have to stick with that. So if that's not exactly what you want to begin with, then maybe you'd want to consider a floating home where you have the ability to be a little bit more creative and put your own touch on it.
One good point to bring up about the difference in a floating home and a manufactured boat is you can sink a manufactured boat.
That's very important.
If your water line breaks or the hole gets a hole in it or the boot from where the motor comes out, anything, a through hole breaks, that manufactured boat will fill full of water and it'll sink. A floating house is like 95% unsinkable. Yeah. If all your floats came out from under it, are the floats just gonna pop out from under it? Hopefully you built it right and they're screwed in. If a hose breaks inside this house and we're gone and we have city water ran to it
and it's filling up with water
and it just constantly pours water into the house, it's not going to sink because there's no hole to fill up. It might screw the floors up. It's going to find a rite of passage back to the lake. It's going to come out, but you're not going to sink it. If you leave pressurized water on a boat and leave and something breaks and it just fills it up, the bilge pump won't keep up and it'll eventually sink the boat. So can you sink a floating cabin? Yeah, it's tough. Can you sink a manufactured boat? Yeah, it's not that hard.
Not speaking from experience or anything. So as far as price goes, there are so many different variables at play there. You can find a really cheap floating cabin, but it's not going to be nice or livable at all. You're going to have to do a lot of work to it. Same with a houseboat. You can find a really old houseboat for 10 grand somewhere, but it's going to be a really old houseboat. You could get a super nice houseboat for $1 million.
Look like a cruise ship on the inside.
There are some floating cabins on this lake that are really nice that are probably worth 300 grand. Ours, on the other hand, we bought for like 25 and put roughly that same amount into a renovation. So we did it on the cheap and this worked for us.
Elbow grease is worth a lot.
Yeah, it really comes down to how much work you're willing to put into it, how much work it needs versus how much money you want to save or how much time and effort you want to save. If you're interested in learning more about, what we did, how we made this floating cabin setup work for us on a budget, we did make a video about that we will link here, and you can watch that next if you'd like.
Y'all have a damn good Christmas.
Yep, otherwise we wish you a Merry Christmas. We hope this was helpful, and a Happy New Year with all of your houseboat and or floating cabin purchasing goals.
And remember, if I don't see you by Christmas, hang your own balls. You gonna put that in there?
Oh yeah.